webinars are made possible thanks to generous donor support. If you'd like to contribute, please visit our website, autism.org.
Moira Peña is an experienced occupational therapist working with children and youth on the autism spectrum at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital in Toronto, Canada. She's an expert hub team member of the ECHO Ontario Autism Program, which aims to further develop pediatricians, school psychologists, and teachers' skills to best support autistic children and youth and their families. A published researcher, Moira has presented nationally and internationally to parents, teachers, occupational therapy practitioners, and other healthcare professionals. Moira is also the proud creator and host of Holland Bloorview's Autism Summit. And now I will turn this over to Moira Peña.
Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to Sensory Processing Differences in Autism Across the Lifespan. And this is part 2 of a webinar series, and it's called Sensory Friendly Strategies for Home. So if you've missed part 1, delivered by Dr. Higashida, please go back to that if you want to learn more around brain and sensory processing differences in autism. So our agenda for today is to learn about sensory processing differences and how they impact a person's behaviors. I am going to introduce you to the 3 most common sensory reactivity profiles, and I'm going to equip you with sensory-friendly strategies that support daily functioning. So what is sensory processing? It is the way in which we interact with the world around us by taking in sensory messages from within our bodies and our surroundings, and the way that we interpret those messages, and then we organize our purposeful responses or our behaviors. This is an ongoing process, and we're constantly taking in sensory information. We organize it and we perform motor actions needed to make sense of our world. It is an unconscious process. Cognition plays a very small role in processing of sensory input. So even when you're sleeping, you can roll to the edge of the bed and roll back, and you can take off your blanket and you never wake up. And that's because of your sensory systems working effectively together. So if we are able to take care of sensory processing automatically, our brain is free to socially interact, to problem solve, to think of a response, and to act in a way that we expect you to. But due to brain and sensory processing differences, sometimes this process that is supposed to happen automatically starts to take up real estate space in your brain. And this is when sensory processing can become disorder. So sensory processing differences range from sensory preferences, like whether I like to wear a certain type of sweater, for example, and sensory quirks, to causing severe dysfunction. But everyone processes sensation, and it impacts every domain of human function and participation. So we have 8 sensory systems. The ones that we all know about, the 5 are your visual system, your auditory, olfactory, gustatory, and your tactile systems. And then we have these 3 hidden senses: your vestibular system, which is your sense of body position and movement, your proprioceptive system, and proprio means property, ceptive means feeling, and that is your joint and muscle sense, and your interoceptive system, which is your sense of your internal organs. So it tells you whether you're hungry, whether you're tired, whether you're in pain, whether you need to use the toilet. And it's also the basis of how we recognize emotional states in our bodies. And I will tell you a little bit more about a few of the senses when we talk about the strategies. We know that up to 96% of children on the autism spectrum are autistic youth, and 94% of autistic adults experience sensory processing differences to such an extent that they significantly impact daily functioning. So we always need to consider sensory processing differences when we're talking about autism. And in 2013, so much so that in 2013, sensory reactivity was added to the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. So there's different criteria that professionals go to diagnose autism. Criterion A is persistence deficits in social communication and social interactions. Criterion B is restricted, repetitive, and stereotype patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And under that criteria, you will see sensory reactivity. And the way that the DSM-IV describes it is as hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So I think we are now learning so much from our autistic self-advocates. And here's Temple Grandin, and she says, one of the most debilitating symptoms for some children and adults with autism is sensory oversensitivity or hyperreactivity. From as far back as I can remember, I always hated to be hugged. It was like a great all-engulfing tidal wave of stimulation. And tactile stimulation for me and many autistics is a no-win situation. Our bodies cry out for human contact, but when the contact is made, we withdraw in pain and confusion. So this is how important it is for us to consider sensory reactivity in autism. But of course, sensory processing differences are not always synonymous to difficulties, but may in fact be a source of unique gifts and quality of life. And here's another quote from non-speaking autistic self-advocate Tito Mukapare. And he says, when a little girl giggles, color the walls and ceilings with rainbow foam when she's amused by my echolalia, I feel blessed for being what I am. And here's where the neurodiversity movement comes in, and they teach us about autism being a different way of being. So it's not a disability, it's a different ability. So there is something to be said about autistic people having access to a world, a sensory world that we are not privy to as a neuromajority. There are different categories for sensory processing differences. And for this talk today, I'm just going to focus on sensory reactivity because that is the category that the DSM-IV includes. So this is also the most common presentation in the clients that I see. And it's actually up to 80% of children and youth who are seen in clinics and hospitals present with sensory reactivity differences. And there are three different subtypes of sensory reactivity profiles. You have your sensory overresponders, which again, the DSM-IV calls hyperreactivity, sensory underresponders or hyporeactivity, and your sensory seekers. And the reason why this is important is that understanding a person's sensory profile helps us to determine the why behind behaviors and to identify what types of supports a person needs to more easily engage, to relate with others, and to learn. So when we're talking about your sensory overresponders or hyperreactivity, so they overreact to sensations, and this person will try to move away or block the sensory input. And particularly you see this in self-care tasks. So think about showering, bathing, dressing, hair cutting, toothbrushing, washing your hair, right? This can be very challenging to people on the autism spectrum because they're sensitive to that stimuli. And of course, when the world is unpredictable to you, a person will react either aggressively or controlling, under quotes, when they're overwhelmed by a sensory stimulation. Sensory overresponders tend to be very cautious, fearful, they're upset by changes in their routines, and they experience significant challenges with transitions. They can be hypervigilant, and that's a very taxing state to be in if that is your reality every day. They can be quite anxious about an unpredictable sensory environment, and to an extreme extent, they may shut down. Sensory overresponders thrive with predictable routines. And here is Emily from, and this is her Instagram account, 21 and Sensory, and she tells us about daily sensory things that are hard to handle. So someone touching her to get her attention, different soaps, new clothing, cooking smells, fire alarm tests, and keeping up in group conversation. So the ability to filter out what's relevant or irrelevant is difficult for her. Socializing, and of course, hand dryers and vacuum cleaners. Your sensory overresponders, when we go to the literature, we know that there are correlations with atypical sensory processing and autism, but also with ADHD, anxiety, gastrointestinal issues, picky eating, sleep problems, self-injurious behavior, and there's increased parental stress and challenges in participating in everyday activities. And I found this finding quite interesting, the fact that families of children with sensory overresponsivity exhibit more impairment than families of children with psychiatric diagnoses. So this is real, and it really gets in the way of functioning, daily functioning for autistic children and youth. And here is another visual from Sensory Scout. And they say, you know you're a sensory parent when you struggle to get him to get in the shower because it's too noisy, but then he will stand there in the water for an hour. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that can relate on this call. We also need to consider that sensory overresponders may be reacting to sensory input in the way that they do because this sensory input is perceived as painful. So I will read out some quotes from autistic self-advocates. The lights that can immediately hurt a lot, right? If textures of food were mixed, the sensation makes me want to feel physically ill. People brushing past me is like pain mixed with panic, and I can become quite aggravated because of it. Bad smells feel quite painful. Loud noise can bother me, and it can feel painful. Every time I am touched, it hurts. It feels like fire running through my body. So in fact, sensory sensitivities may actually predispose autistic people to chronic pain. So again, this is why we need to validate the lived experience of autistic people and reframe our understanding, because this sensory input that maybe the neuromajority doesn't even sense, that it is perceived as painful by some. This also explains this idea that sensory inputs add up throughout the day to then have this sensory meltdowns. And here's a great visual from the OT butterfly. So this phenomenon is called allodynia, which is when you're perceiving non-painful sensations as irritating, non-pleasant, or painful. And this research is done by Dr. Barshalita in Israel. And what we know is that these sensations are higher in intensity and linger for a longer duration after the stimulus is over. And this can explain the accumulation of adversive sensations experienced by individuals with SOR. So to give you an example, and I'll go through this visual. So here is a school-age child, and they wake up and all of the clothing starts to bother that person. So it's itchy. And then they go into school and they go into a loud music class, or what they perceive to be loud, right? Then they get bumped into. Then they fall off the swing set. Then there's a construction site nearby. So the sound is also bombarding this person. Then they get their sleeves wet from the rain. And again, that feeling that they are aversive to. And then you simply ask what color of cup they want for their drink, and you get this huge meltdown. And this usually happens after they get home from school, because they've sort of held it together during the day. So the behavior is the meltdown because they got the wrong cup. But the reasoning behind it, it's sensory. It's the sensory accumulation of adversive experiences. And once we understand that, we can then shift over to a stance of compassion. And then we know what to do. And we know that it's not willful behavior. We know that there's a sensory basis to that behavior. So we talked about your sensory over responders, your sensory under responders. They do not react to sensory input in the way they should be reacting to it. They're often unaware of body sensations. They can't really tell you if they're hungry, if they're thirsty. The sensations to go to the bathroom are delayed. They're also not quite sure of what emotions should feel like in their body. So they tend to go from 0 to 100 and not recognize the sensations in their body that is telling them that they're becoming angry or anxious. They engage in passive behaviors. They like to lie down on the floor. They lean on others. They're seeking input because they're under-responsive. They do not notice others in the room. They're slow to respond. They're quiet, withdrawn. They're uninterested in exploring games, and they often fall through the cracks. They're not usually the kids that you would say are experiencing behaviors, because they tend to sort of just be in their own world. But because they're constantly in the state, again, of, it looks like a lack of motivation, but that does not mean that it's not stressful to them. So they're in a stress state, which makes them become quite tired quite quickly. Sensory under responders may lack awareness of danger. They are jumping from high heights, they're crossing streets, but they thrive with explicit and multi-sensory teaching. And here's a visual from Sophie, sensory OT. Do you know this person? They're quiet, they're not responding to stimuli, they're passive, poor body awareness, they bump into things, they're withdrawn, and difficult to engage. And again, it could be that these behaviors, they have a sensory cost to them. I do want to bring up your attention to some new concepts that we are now trying to understand and recognize. And this is, again, this whole paradigm shift where we are learning from autistic voices, and we're recognizing the gap between intention and action in autism, where we now know that some autistic people are not able to actually control their bodies. So, and if you think about it, speech is a motor action as well. So it also affects your communication. They're not able to communicate because they can't control the muscles, their motor planning and the muscles in their body. And this is a quote from Naoki Higashida, who's an autistic self-advocate. And he says, "One of the biggest misunderstandings you have about us is your belief that our feelings aren't as subtle and complex as yours, because how we behave can appear so childish in your eyes, you tend to assume that we are childish on the inside too. Stuck here inside these unresponsive bodies of ours with feelings we can't properly express is always a struggle just to survive." So again, it may look like lack of motivation, lack of wanting to get started, but it really does have a motor difference root to it, and a sensory difference. And if you want to learn more around these new concepts, so these are called autistic inertia and burnout. And I recommend this open access paper that I put up there. And of course, I will give you the handouts, and you can click on that and it will take you to the paper, and it will give you an understanding of what autistic people are experiencing in terms of this new way of understanding motor differences in autism. So we talked about sensory over-responders, sensory under-responders, and now we're going to talk about sensory seekers. And I think a lot of you are quite familiar with sensory seekers. They seek constant stimulation, they like to crash, they bump, bumping others, bumping themselves against the wall, they love to jump, roughhousing. They're constantly touching objects, they like to lick, mouth, chew on objects, and they take excessive risks during play or when engaged in physical activities. But they thrive in active and multi-sensory environments and when given access to sensory tools. So when you think, again, when we go back to our sensory systems, I want to tell you about some of the behaviors that I've seen in my practice, and for you to sort of start to get an understanding of how you can view behaviors differently. So if we start with the visual system, so I was thinking of the child who refuses to go outside and wants all the curtains closed at home because of the sensitivity to the light, or a hyporeactive child who is mesmerized by the way that the light shines through his fingers, for example. So, you know, they're seeking some sort of sensation, some visual sensation through this dimming behavior through the fingers. Auditory, and this is one that I think people quite recognize, children who put their hands on their ears to cover them from sound, particularly around vacuum cleaners, hair dryers, flashing toilets, automatic flashing toilets, public bathrooms. So that is, I think, quite common. And that's a sensory over-responder to sound. And a sensory under-responder might be the person who vocalizes at high pitches because he likes the sound and vibration of that sound, right? Going on to olfactory, thinking of the adult who's an extreme picky eater and only eats chicken fingers and muffins, for example, and they're very rigid around their diet. And that's an over-responder. An under-responder is the youth who was at risk for choking because he would put so much food into his mouth and not chew it that he became that just became a risk for a choking hazard, right? So he's seeking a lot of input by stuffing his mouth and sort of feeling the food with his cheeks, and then he would just swallow it whole. Okay. When we're talking about the tactile system, I'm thinking of the many school-age children who refuse to wear socks because of the seams, right? So, and I will never forget the mom who was crying at my session, telling me about the exact seam that the sock needed to have for her child to go to school. And of course, I live in a cold country, and like not wearing socks is not an option when we have like -30 weather sometimes. And so again, this can really become, really affect your functioning and your mental health. So, and then if you're an under-responder, the child who likes to touch everything at the grocery store, right? So they're just constantly touching things and running their fingers through the walls and so on. Going to your vestibular system, your over-responder is your child who will not get off the car because they just cannot manage sort of the idea of getting their feet off the car onto another surface. the child, an over-responder, they will not tilt their head back for the mom to wash the hair, for example. This was a case that I had, and they just couldn't wash this little girl's hair because she just would not bring her head back. And then an under-responder in the vestibular system are the kids who are spinning, who are rocking, who are putting their heads in interesting positions. So they may be talking to you and sort of putting their heads in a way that they're activating the vestibular system in some way. And then, of course, you have your proprioceptive system. And this is a child who under-responsive, and they're just leaning onto others and almost pushing against other people. I had a kid who would go and pick up other kids in the playground because, you know, he was seeking that deep pressure input. And then your interoceptive system, you have, I can think of an adult who was limping and finally went to the ER, and it turns out that he had a fracture in his hip, and he's been there for months, and he just could not sense or could not express that he was in pain. And then in the opposite way, so an over-responder in the interoceptive system will be somebody who begins crying just by somebody just bumping onto them really lightly. So they really feel that sensation to a extreme extent. So what do we do? And this is, it's a sensory diet approach, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And this is an effective tool for supporting sensory processing difference. And I hope that most of you have heard of it before, but I'm going to go through the elements of a sensory diet and how you can incorporate that into your daily life. So what is a sensory diet approach? And there's many different names that people call it. I like to call it the sensory diet approach, but I think you might have heard of sensory supports plan or a sensory lifestyle or simply a feel-good menu. And this really comes from the work of Dr. Jane Ayers, and she was an OT who really is the person who is the pioneer in the world of sensory processing and integration. And she talked about sensations being food for the brain, and they provide the knowledge needed to direct the body and mind. And a sensory diet provides the necessary combinations of sensory input to feed or nourish a person's nervous system. That's Dr. Patricia Wilbarger. And from Dr. Lucy J. Miller, a sensory lifestyle is how you incorporate the sensory tools that you have into everyday life. There are short-term goals of a sensory diet approach and long-term goals. And your short-term goals is to help an over-responsive person to modulate reactions to sensory input, or increase the alertness level of an under-responder, right? It's also a short-term goal is to prevent uncomfortable and painful reactions to sensory stimuli and to support an optimal level of function and participation. And really is to gain an understanding as to why certain behaviors occur. Your long-term goals of a sensory diet approach is to understand your own sensory profile and why people react in the way that they do. And I think that is so important for anybody, but particularly neurodivergent people, to get to know themselves and what their sensory preferences are and what their sensory differences are and what they can do. If you understand, it helps you understand which sensory supports are effective in helping a person to self-regulate when faced with stressful situations. So this helps the person to learn which accommodations to ask for. So this is all about self-advocacy. So once you know what is effective for you to be able to live your best life, then you are able to ask for those accommodations. A long-term goal of a sensory diet is to support the person's ability to participate in different contexts. So if they want to go on an outing, or if they want to go to a restaurant now that we're hopefully going back to our old way of being, or a social event, that they can do that provided that they have some sensory supports or accommodations in place. And of course, a sensory diet will give you opportunities for practice to improve your endurance and your motor planning skills, which are so important, especially when we talk about those motor differences in autism, where people may not be in full control of their bodies. So again, practicing those motor planning skills. And of course, a long-term goal of a sensory diet is to improve a person's quality of life. So what are the components of a sensory diet approach? And there are 4. And the first one is to have a schedule of sensory inputs. You could also call them activities. I like the word input. So you can do this by having a formal schedule where, for example, in a school, this is often done where at specific times during the day, you will have a sensory break of some kind. Or my preference is to embed them into daily routines. So what you are already doing, then you're actually embedding your sensory diet activities within that routine. So very often I will ask families to tell me what they do from the moment they get up to the moment they go to bed, and how then I can work with what they are already doing so that it doesn't become extra work. Because of course, like all of us, myself included, if we see something as extra work, we're a lot less likely to do it. So number 1 is the schedule of sensory inputs. Number 2, and equally as important, is these environmental adaptations or accommodations, and having access to sensory supports and tools. We'll talk about that. Number 3 is the way that the person who's supporting the autistic person is the way they interact, and their ability to be a co-regulating force in that person's life. And number 4 is the leisure and recreation activities that you choose. If you want to know more information around sensory-based interventions and the sensory diet approach, you can read a paper that I wrote with colleagues in 2021, and it was published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. And again, you will have my handouts and you can click onto that paper because it is open access. But what we need to remember is that an effective sensory diet is personalized. You know, there are individual differences. Each person, each neurodivergent person is a different person. And so we need to personalize the sensory diet as much as we can. They also require active and collaborative problem solving. And the goal is really to help that person balance their sensory over-responsivity and sensory under-responsivity and sensory seeking qualities to achieve sensory health. Because very often, most often than not, you can be sensory over-responsive in one sensory system and sensory under-responsive in another sensory system. So for example, you can be a sensory seeker in the tactile system and need a fidget tool and need to touch things for you to be able to be grounded in your body. But you can also be a sensory over-responder in your auditory system. So you need to wear noise canceling headphones or some sort of ear defenders for you to be able to manage the sounds, everyday sounds. So the way that we do this is that you become a sensory detective. And the way that we do that is by first looking at the behavior with no judgment. Whatever it may look like, we first say, okay, what is the behavior? And we label it. And then you reflect. When does the behavior happen? I'm looking for patterns. What prompts it to happen? So that's what we call antecedents. You know, are there any triggers that I should be aware of? Who does it happen with? So then I would be looking, oh, okay, so, you know, who is the person it tends to happen with? So what is happening in that interaction style, that relationship? Where does it happen? Why do you think it happens? I think it's very important. Parents know their children best and partners know their partners best. So I'm really curious as to what they think as to why the behavior is happening. And really to put on your sensory goggles and really think about what is the person seeking or avoiding. So in that behavior, what are they seeking? Pressure? Are they seeking visual, or what are they trying to avoid? What strategy do you want to try together to see if it decreases the frequency and intensity of the behavior? So very often, some behaviors will not disappear, but if you can decrease the intensity and the frequency, then that's a win. And did the strategy work? So then we come back to the table together and did this work? And if it did, what could we do more of? If it didn't, what could we do less of? So it really is a sensory diet approach. Because we are such complex individual creatures, it is complex. And it requires a level of trial and error when you're working with an occupational therapist to see what the right sensory diet inputs should be throughout the day. So I mentioned about talking about a few of the sensory systems. I'm going to talk about three, which is the senses that we call the power senses. And these are the vestibular, proprioceptive, and tactile sensory systems. And the reason we call them the power senses is because they are the ones that have the most impact on the nervous system on the journey to self-regulation. And even if you're an over-responder or under-responder or sensory seeker, the power senses should be effective for all three types of sensory reactivity profiles. So your vestibular system, this is the system that tells you if you're moving forwards or backwards, if you're moving in circles, if your head is upside down. It works together with all of the systems, but in particular with the visual and the proprioceptive system. It is what Dr. Jane Ayers called the master sense. It integrates movement information with all of the senses. And this is interesting. It contributes to your sense of emotional security because there is projections in the brain to the limbic system, which is where your emotions are. So again, if your processing of vestibular information is not as effective as you'd like it to be, you will feel unsafe in the world. And that causes anxiety and hypervigilance. So again, look at everything that the vestibular system affects, right? Your trunk extensors, your emotional state, your posture, your motor planning, controlling your eye muscles, and of course, your autonomic nervous system, whether you go into a fight, flight, or freeze state. So there's a lot that the vestibular system is doing. So how do you incorporate the vestibular system into your daily life? And again, once you start thinking the way, there's thousands of ideas, but I wanted to give you ones that are definitely low cost and that you can start to try at home. Yoga has a lot of evidence for providing effective sensory input. Ways that you can provide movement is also to have flexible seating options. So these movable surfaces are very effective. You can even try to embed movement into your daily life. So if you're, for example, doing a household chore and you have a laundry basket, so the idea of like picking up the laundry basket and it's somewhat heavy, so that's the proprioceptive deep pressure input that it's also effective. Moving it, making sure, being intentional as to where you may leave that laundry basket, so then you have to walk to it to get it, to then go take it to the washer and dryer. So again, incorporated movement opportunities throughout your day. I like the Simply Fit boards. They are pretty cost effective, and it allows you to move side to side. If it's a child, it allows you to spin around as well. I know a lot of people have these swings in their homes. And again, these are very close to the ground and they are to be used with adult supervision. But I know that people have found those very effective to just provide some common movement input. Same with using trampolines. You have to have safe jumping. So I do prefer the ones that have the side supports to them. But again, it's providing this linear movement that is regulating in the nervous system. And even if you're at work, I did not know until recently that office chairs have like a rocking mechanism to them. So, you know, spending a couple of minutes and taking breaks, pacing yourself throughout the day with some of this vestibular input is effective for your sensory health. Now let's talk about, so that's one power sense. The second power sense is your proprioceptive system, and your proprioceptive system is what gives us a map of the body without the aid of vision. So it's really our innate knowledge of what muscles are flexing and where your body parts are in space. So it's what the receptors that tell you if you're going up the stairs without having to look at your feet, if you're bending, if you're reaching, if you're going out from a darkened room and you have to sort of feel your way. So it's your sense of body awareness. And we know that the proprioceptive system works with the vestibular sense and visual sensory systems to keep your posture upright, to develop balance, and reacts when posture is challenged. So again, your proprioceptive system adds to your sense of safety in the world. We know that in autism, there are research findings that the proprioceptive system is not working as effectively as we might like. And in particularly around this, what we call grading of movement. So usually I find that my clients, they might either hold the pencil and break it because they hold it too tight, or hold the pencil like a paintbrush. So it's that sort of how much pressure should I put on something? And that's what they're having difficulties with, right? So they mean to tap somebody and they end up whacking that person. They mean to walk and they're stomping. It's almost like they're just having difficulties gauging the type of pressure that needs to be given to a certain movement. So when you're putting on a backpack, that's your proprioceptive system, because you're not looking at your backpack, you just know where it is. And this is what OTs call heavy work. And I'm sure if you work with an OT, you've heard this in the past. And what we mean is to try to engage and strategically put these activities within your day that involve carrying, pulling, pushing, dragging, squeezing, and lifting activities. And if you think about it, a lot of the behaviors that we see, that we have a hard time making sense of, they involve a level of this. So is the person trying to carry something or pull something or push against someone because they're trying to get this deep pressure input and this sort of level of heavy work. And so the types of sensory inputs that you can think about are things like chewing. So chewing gum, for example, using that chewlery, those sensory tools, or even just crunchy snacks like carrots or anything that is crunchy and will take a long time to chew, that adds that heavy work component to the day. You could also wear a heavier backpack or clothing, and think about how difficult it is for some teens on the spectrum to move from winter to spring, for example. So the heaviness of the clothing help them in their sensory world. And so it's hard to then go to just wearing a t-shirt. Tug of war, I love using tug of war strategically. So before difficult transitions, you might want to engage your person on a tug of war to get that pressure input and then go through that difficult transition. So say doing a tug of war before having dinner might be an idea. Pushing the wall away, climbing, jumping, hanging activities, biking, swimming, lifting weights, and again, household chores, taking out the garbage, pushing the garbage can around, going to the grocery store and pushing the grocery cart with you, bouncing on a ball. If you have a little place, and if your child is young, digging in the dirt, and if you live in Canada, snow shoveling. has a lot of heavy work to it, that's for sure. Chair push-ups are when you're pushing down on your chair and you're holding yourself up for a couple of seconds. And here's a great visual from OT Inspired, again, from social media and Instagram. And it says, how can I do heavy work with my kids? So go for a bike ride, put away the groceries, play tag of war, climb at the park, do yoga, animal walking, pull a wagon. So if your child is running off and a way to slow them down and to also get that heavy work is by getting them to pull a wagon behind them on the way to school, for example. Water the plants, heavy water can, water the plants outside. Monkey bars, stomping your feet, trying to push over the wall, pushing your hands together to squish a bug, and of course, digging in the sand or the dirt. And again, lots of different ideas. And so think about what your person is already doing. And if they're seeking this heavy work, then how can you change so that they can get the same input, but in a way that it's more seen as more socially appropriate, for lack of a better word. Okay, and then your last power sense is your tactile system. So this is your essential system for development, communication, and relationships. Their tactile system provides information about light, touch, vibration, deep pressure, temperature, and movement. It is the most problematic sensory system affecting activities of daily living in autistic people. And it really does get in the way when it's affecting dressing, toothbrushing, face washing, hair combing, feeding, and sleep. And I love this visual. So I received a mask from my autistic son, but he didn't like that it went around his ears. I added a couple of buttons to his favorite hat and boom, problem solved. So again, this is a mom who validated the child's sensory experience and worked around it so that those straps are not behind the child's ears. So again, we're thinking about deep touch pressure. So again, your child might be already asking you for very tight hugs. So teaching them to engage in self-hugs. Massage is a intervention that has quite a lot of lovely research behind it. So providing massage to the person or seeing if they can go to a massage therapist. Wearing spandex clothing. So trying it out, right? So like a smaller swimming shirt, or tights or compression or a sportswear, for example. The sandwich game is when you have a young child and you're squishing them with pillows and asking them, what would you like on your sandwich? And would you like ketchup? And then you squish them again, squishing with pillows, pushing hands together, pulling them apart, crashing onto mattresses. So your children might be crashing onto things already. So actually strategically making some time where they are actually able to crash onto a mattress in the house, for example, the use of fidget tools. And again, this is a new thing where I now know from autistic self-advocates that it is not childish to use fidget tools for them. It is a way for them to have their sensory needs met. And I love beanbag chairs because they provide, like you can sink into them and they provide that pressure that we're looking for. So a person is more able to stay seated because they're having this deep pressure input around them. I also love this stretch ease for an adult, again, providing that deep touch pressure that we're looking for. Number 2 is your environmental adaptations and access to sensory tools. So remember, adapt the environment, dim the lights, provide predictability through a visual choice board and schedules, reduce the noise, make your routines predictable, provide access to sensory supports and tools, and very important is to create safe spaces or islands of retreat. What you will find is what I call the biology comes first principle. We always have to consider, is the person hungry, thirsty, tired, or in pain? Or is the person under a particular stress? So on days that, for example, school-age children go to school, that's a stressful, potentially stressful sensory event for them. So you will see that their skills decrease on those days because they're already stressed out as to this unpredictability that may be coming to them. And so then it's okay to provide more accommodations and sensory supports on those days. And I love this visual. Don't tell me it's not loud. Don't tell me it's not bright. Don't tell me I don't need my sunglasses. Don't tell me I don't need my headphones. I am autistic. I know my needs. Self-advocacy is key. So be proactive and prepare for sensory overwhelm. Create a sensory kit and sensory friendly spaces or sensory havens. And again, I love these. So here is a little corner for this young child, a bed and some twinkly lights, some low cost options. I like this, like just a blanket. And again, the child is very low to the ground. Here is a little corner of the house for this young child. And again, it's just a blanket, a way where she can retreat. It's an island of retreat. And here's an adult on the autism spectrum, and they are telling us about what they have in their kit. So their headphones, the Tango, the smartwatches with this app that kind of gives you the routines that you're going through in the day, sunglasses, hats, earplugs, and so on. So being prepared really helps, and really recognizing that sensory strategies are mental health interventions. They support your mental health. They support the way that you feel and the way that you are in the world. So of course, we need to value that and recognize that and provide those supports. And here again is Emily, and she's telling us about the coping strategies that she uses on public transport. And look how interesting, she is prepared. The headphones, earbuds, the fidgets, she's bringing her favorite smell even, something to crunch on, tapping her fingers. And here is ADHD, the mini ADHD coach, and what she does for sensory overload. She's prepared with sunglasses, noise canceling headphones, and fragrance-free laundry detergent. Number 3 is your interaction style. And remember that we now know that our nervous systems, we're able to co-regulate others. And so be very cognizant of the way that you are with the people that you're supporting. Because however you feel, your kids feel it too. Our brains resonate with each other. Take good care of yourself so you can spread calm instead of fear. So even though you may feel everything but calm, we need to be cognizant that not to add more chaos to a person who's already sensory dysregulated. So to promote flexibility, we need to model flexibility and really be thinking, am I co-escalating or am I co-regulating? And the way I think it's very important that if your person is escalating, that you do the exact opposite, right? So they're starting to pace and talk fast. You want to talk slow. You want to slow down your movements. It's like a teeter-totter. You want to do the opposite. You're co-regulating that person into some level of regulation. And number 4, but not least, is really what you choose as recreation or leisure activities. And again, now that we're hopefully going back to our old way of being, just choosing some things that will provide those power senses within them. So, and the red activities are evidence-based activities that have been found to support autistic people in managing interfering behaviors. So you have swimming, which is also a life skill, and you'll see that a lot of autistic people love swimming because of the weight of the water, and they'll stay at the bottom for a while once they learn to swim because they love to feel that weight. Martial arts, horseback riding has 5 good papers behind it, so which I found interesting. Of course, never forgetting that recreation should be just fun. So bike riding, running has also some nice evidence behind it. And even just if you're just gonna try an outing, trying something that involves that deep pressure, heavy work component, like bowling, for example, because they're heavy as it is, stretching, and so on. So again, I'm sure you can think of a lot more moving forwards. So remember to embrace complexity and individual differences in autism. Growth is a process of experimentation, a series of trials, errors, and occasional victories. The failed experiments are as much a part of the process as the experiments that work. So I call these productive fails. We try different strategies and we keep data. And if they work, we do more of that. If they don't work, that actually gives me information as to what I may try next. So productive fails are okay. And they're part of the process because we're all complex individuals. So here's a sensory diet approach in action. This is my favorite sensory seeker, Calvin. And she says, didn't you hear the bell? Recess is over. It's time to go in. I'm not done yet. It takes me more than one recess to wear myself into a state of submission. So what are the summaries from today's talk? Is to become a sensory detective and think about what sensory experiences the individual on the autism spectrum might be seeking or might be trying to prevent by engaging in the observable behavior. Validate the feelings. Sensory input can be perceived as painful and the pain may actually linger. Adopt a sensory diet approach to learn how to best support the autistic person's sensory needs. Design low-cost, sensory safe spaces within your living and workspaces, and be prepared by creating a sensory kit if planning to enter a potentially sensory overwhelming experience. Co-regulation is key. Be aware of your own reactions as a parent, as a partner, or an ally, as they may compound the autistic person's experience of sensory overwhelm. And last but not least, embrace productive fails. Human beings are complex. Reach out for an evaluation and support from an occupational therapist and work together in the creation of an individualized sensory diet that best meets the autistic person's sensory needs. And I thank you very much for your time. I have attached some resources that I have worked on with Dr. Fakri Shafai, who has done the first section of this webinar a couple of weeks ago, and we have a sensory processing differences toolkit. I remember I told you there's also sensory processing differences also affect feeding, and we have a toolkit on that, as well as sleep, and that's for AID Canada, and that's aidcanada.ca, which is a great website with lots of resources. I've given you some resources for some sensory tools and also my favorite books in the subject for your review, and for the clinicians and the researchers in the crowd. There's 4 pages of references from this presentation, and thank you so much. And I am at moirapeña.com if you want to connect with me. Thank you. Okay, and I see lots of chats. Let me see, and some questions. Let's see how many. I think we can do 5 minutes, and yes, I'm gonna give you the slides. Let's see, what else can I answer? Right, so there's a message here. A 14-year-old girl with autism has difficulties in being continent of urine, and I think it is interoception sensory problem. Yes, probably an underreactive interoceptive system, and therefore she needs help in identifying what those feelings are within her body that will help her to identify to go to the bathroom. Okay. Okay, so can I comment on the role of endogenous carbon monoxide in modulating sensory hyper and hyposensitivities as a neurotransmitter? And I really have no idea about that, so I really cannot comment. Let's see. What other questions can I answer? One second. Let me see. Okay, so can a child have both hyper with some stimulants, I hyper-responder with other. Oh, so can they be both hyper to sensory stimuli and hypo? Yes, and that's most often the case, that you are you have these different types of sensory reactivity in different sensory systems. So again, this is why it's complex. Unfortunately, we don't tend to fit in nice little boxes and stay there. So, and of course, you know, if you're particularly stressed, if you didn't sleep, if you didn't eat, if you are in pain or tired, your sensory systems will also be more, you will also experience more issues on that day. So it also depends on the type of day that you're having and in your biology. Okay. Let's see, I hope that answered that question. As an autistic woman, I want to say thank you so much for listening to autistic people while doing your research. Yes, we finally got him there. And I'm sorry it's taken long for researchers, but now, you know, best practice is to have autistic people in our research boards, and for us to actually be looking at what autistic people need and want and how to support people best. So it is great to see, and I have learned so much from interacting with autistic people. Okay, let's see. So I have another question here. Within one sensory system, can you respond differently depending on the input to that system? Yes, and the responsive to one type and over responsive to another. Yes, absolutely. And it changes sometimes within the same day, same hour, within minutes, right? And so again, it's I think the message of this talk is really for us, when we see a behavior, to reframe it and to try to dig deeper as to what the input might be that may be causing the behavior, and then for us to step into a stance of compassion, right? Over time, is a sensory problem resolved automatically? I wish. I think what happens, and for the autistic self-advocates on the call, I would love to know, I think what happens is that people, and we all do, we just get better at avoiding what we don't like as we get older, and choosing what we like. And the world after school is done, you're able to sort of control your life a bit more around that. So I don't know if it gets better, but I think you're able to manage your world a lot better, and you're less, so you experience fewer moments of sensory overwhelm. Okay. Okay, let's see. Whoa, I have lots of questions on the question and answer. So I wonder how much time we have. Maybe I'll do a few more, and then we'll be done. Okay.
Yes, Moira, we've got time for just a couple more questions.
Okay.
I would suggest that there's so many questions that maybe we could have you back soon for a live Q&A.
Absolutely. I would love to come back. I love all the webinars that your organization has. Okay, so let's do two more then. So how many times a day a person should stimulate his power senses, their vestibular, your proprio, and tactile, to be effective? So the way you need to think about it is that you want to embed a power sense activity prior to a difficult transition. So for example, before going out the door for school, you might want to have a tug of war with your child, count to 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then get out the door. Before having dinner, right as that person is coming in, after a day of work or after a day of school, when they're super like overwhelmed with sound or with sensory input, you want to do something there then. So it could be something like, you know, push against my hands and let's hold it for 10 seconds, or let's push the wall away and let's hold it for 10 seconds. Or, hey, can you take out the garbage before they even come into the house? So you're sort of providing this helpful input that will then calm that nervous system down. Okay, and so the way that you are using a sensory diet is strategic. to really help you through difficult moments in your day. I hope that's helpful. And it's always short duration, high intensity. Anything that's going on for a long time, no one's going to do. So it has to be something that is doable, that is easy to do. It has power, so it's intense, but it's short duration. So if you're doing a tug of war, you know, as hard as you can, let's hold it for 5 seconds, really hard, really hard, really hard, and then go. Okay, that's intense, short duration, and you go on your way. Okay. And I see here a comment for Vibe earplugs in Amazon. They're very comfortable for relief. Yes, I like those. And if you go to my website, you will see a whole list of ear defenders done by autistic people. And those are in there. And there's like, I think like 4 or 5 pages. So again, learning from autistic people as to what works for them.